From the Chronicles of the Sisters of Lupin, penned by one Helena. We were simply not ready. It wasn't a lack of faith that brought this thought to our minds. It was a simple understanding of our circumstances and what we now faced. The rumbling and tremendous commotion made in front of us matched with the sound of battle behind us. I looked over my forces and sighed to myself. There were over 200 warmongers in the Sisters of Lupin. Now, about 170 of us stood here to face the greenskin reinforcements that were coming. The others were either injured or assisting in the battle behind us for the slopes. Joining our number were at least 100 Shugoki guard and Aramusha warriors. Among them was Jubei, the former daimyo, and Otomo, the Shugoki retainer of Lady Tomoe. He claimed he'd been sent to see to my protection, although I suspect it was mostly to keep an eye on me and make sure I was here to help and not to do any harm. I don't know what he expected. But to be fair, the warmongers don't have that much of a respectable reputation. It is the most peculiar thing. Since I swore myself to the warmongers and took up my sword, I devoted myself to conflict, to battle, to war, as had we all. We've been told that it is better to find an enemy to war against than an ally to aid you. Only the weak sheep require bonds of brotherhood to stand strong. A wolf can hunt alone or with a pack. Bold words from Astria so long ago, and yet I see no contradiction in fighting alongside allies as I do fighting against enemies. I look behind me at the noble legion fighting alongside their sworn rivals and enemies, the Hrafenfeld Vikings. Combined with the desperate forces of the Mire, I see no sheep among them all. Astria was wrong about them, but I'd known that for years, which is why I'd formed the Sisters of Lupin in the first place. But how much was she wrong about? I was still working to determine that. "Movement!" Aramusha shouted. I turned my head forward once more to see that he was indeed correct. A mob of green was coming down the hill towards us, clouds of ash and dirt being thrown into the air in the wake of their stampede. Their numbers were great, easily beyond 1,000 in strength. A small force compared to the one behind us and the rest of the allies were currently fighting, but one that was all too dangerous for us to be faced with our meager-sized force of around 2, maybe 300. Our only hope was to see the power of corruption, use it to slow their advance and stall for time. After all, this was, in the end, a suicide attempt. Even Knight Warden William knew this, but we would fight all the same. Because that is what life is. Conflict and battle. Live and die in battle and war. Never let yourself give way to cowardice. If you are to die, let it be facing the enemy. "Hold fast," I ordered. "Once they reach the ridge, advance. Prepare your corruptions." My warmongers stood forward in anticipation. The massive green menaces were roaring and bellowing as they charged. Axes and clubs raised as they drove towards us in makeshift armor that did little to cover their filthy bodies. "Go!" I bellowed. The warmongers advanced fast, with myself beside them. Draconite charges clutched in our gauntlets. As we came upon the howling monsters, we threw them with all our might at the enemy. The green shards burst on impact with the enemy and filled the air with the noxious green cloud. We jumped back instinctively, knowing not to let ourselves be exposed for too long. Our armor could defend us from some of it, but not for long periods. Note: from what I've gathered, warmongers are initiated by first slaying an enemy among the knights, taking their armor, and bringing it to their hidden Draconite forges to be refashioned. The Draconite being used to refashion the armor increases its ability to withstand the deadly compound, and the helmets they wear are all very close as to prevent excess gas from being inhaled. However, it is not entirely foolproof, and many warmongers fall victim to their own corruption if not careful. The effects were just as potent as they were in Hrafenfeld. The orcs caught in the blast screamed in agony as their insides were torn apart by the destructive corruption. Green monsters fell to the ground, coughing blood and howling in rage and pain. Note: I had begun researching the effects of Draconite on the body after discovering the stones themselves. However, after learning the origin of the substance, I ceased all further investigation and ordered as much of it confiscated as I could. There are some items man was not meant to meddle with, and this is one of them. Our satisfaction was short-lived. The unaffected orcs were already trampling over their fellows to reach us, stomping with thunderous ferocity as they raged on, swinging mercilessly at us. Move! Otomo was in front of me before I could blink. Though large, the shugoki moved with unquestionable speed. The massive shugoki guards were now engaging the enemy, and if ever there was a chance to test their legendary demonic strength, this was certainly it. The green demons versus the Myers Oni. What a battle. A huge orc swung his axe down, and Otomo blocked with his kanabo before headbutting the brute. The orc staggered back, its nose broken, as Otomo crushed its head with another swing of his club. I'm not sure how, but the shugoki, though only 100 or so, were holding back the orc tide. Likely because orcs are not used to fighting beings as strong as themselves. Granted, an average shugoki is certainly not as strong as an average orc, but I'm certain the orcs weren't expecting such stiff resistance and raw physical strength from a group of rotund humans in demon armor. Plus, there's substantial evidence to show that orcs can be influenced by a certain imagery. As said before, orc mentality is fascinating. If orcs believe something collectively, then that belief can be made real. So, if the orcs suddenly saw a pack of oversized humans wearing demonic armor suddenly charging at them with lightning speed, to the collective green-skinned minds, these might be above-average humans or literal demons capable of matching them, thus temporarily allowing for an equitable outcome of raw power between the two. However, as you will see soon, such beliefs don't last long and are mitigating at best. You see, orcs have a hard time imagining anything being as big or as bad as they are. The Aramusha followed the assault, their dual swords hacking and slashing through exposed green flesh to render the forward vanguard useless. My sisters and I were not to be outdone. Flanking along the left and right, we threw ourselves into the fray. Our steel ran true, puncturing the crude and near useless armor of the greenskins and hacking through their arms, their jaws, their legs. Our armor was drenched in blood as we made meat out of the enemy. But despite all our ferocity and all the fury we could muster, we were losing ground. It wasn't for lack of trying, but no matter how hard we pushed, the orcs pushed harder. I didn't have to see my sisters and brothers falling. I could hear it in their screams. I heard an Aramusha get yanked off his feet and thrown like a doll. 2 warmongers were crunched like stale biscuits under the clubs of the orcs, and all around me, the green monsters were beginning to overwhelm our position. "We need to fall back," Otomo encouraged. "Get to a better position." "There is no better position," I argued. "We give up this ground, the greenskins will press into the battle below, and then we're all lost." Otomo cursed in his language, and then resumed the fight. I was impressed with the warrior skill these samurai showed. I had seen their ilk before, and I knew not to underestimate them, but there was no question in my mind about how this battle would end. With a jolt of pain, I felt a mighty green hand swing into my ribcage and knock me backwards. Had it not been for my armor, the blow would have surely been enough to break me in half. I rolled at least 3 or 4 times as I struggled to get back to my feet, but the monster was coming towards me with tremendous speed. I felt my helmet roll off of my head, and I clutched for my sword as blood trickled from my forehead. Otomo rushed in and hit the orc across the head with his club, sending it sprawling backwards. "Get up, Lupin! We need to—" I stared in horror as a massive axe buried itself into Otomo's shoulder, plunging through his muscles and down almost into his chest. An orc he had not seen had taken him and was now roaring triumphantly as he was holding the blade into Otomo's mighty, crumbling form. Otomo hissed. I will never forget the face Otomo made as he raised his hands and grabbed the orc's face with his own bare fists. His hands began to crush the orc's head like a grape in his fists. He roared with as much vigor as the beasts themselves, and just as it seemed he was about to take the upper hand, suddenly 3 other orcs ran and butchered him, hacking into the ground like a giant hunk of cow flesh. "Damn it all," I whispered. "Why, you bastard!" I had no special connection to Otomo, but he had risked his life to save mine, and even as he knew he was about to die, he still fought back. If Tomoe lived through this battle, I would report to her how gallant her shugoki guard had been in his final moments. But now was not the time to mourn. I pulled my sword and raised it, spitting blood. "Come at me, you cowards!" I screamed. "Show me what passes for fury amongst your misbegotten kind!" Ironically, this phrase she shouted is also one common among Astartes' legions as a taunt or insult hurled at Xenos they confront. Where she picked it up, I'm not sure. The monsters rushed me with a will that rivaled on fanatic, whirling blades wildly and gnashing their teeth like savages. The first I sidestepped and hacked at his leg before turning and clawing the second across the maw. It didn't slow him as he just kept striking. I was forced to duck his swing and stab into his thigh, but he was closely followed by the third, who howled and brought his mighty sword down where I stood. I rolled away from him before turning and hacking my sword deep into his neck. Blood sprayed out as it moaned and fell. Its allies, unbothered by this death, closed in on me furiously. I hissed angrily to myself, lacking the strength to endure this much more. My eyes caught sight of the battle around me, and it was grim. Our forces were being routed. Warmongers that held the line were being slaughtered. Only a handful of shugokis were still left fighting, and I counted 9 Aramusha in total. We were to lose this battle. The orcs had broken through. I raised my sword in trembling hands, more from fatigue than from fear. I simply had to embrace my fate. Suddenly there was an explosion. Fire burst all around me, and the orcs before me were swallowed in the engulfing inferno as flames seemed to fall from the sky. I gasped and spun around to see where it had come from. I saw nothing, and even the rest of the army of orcs didn't seem all that interested, until they and I heard the melodious call of a horn calling from atop a hill in the east. I looked, and there stood a sight I would not have expected. The Aochin. Tian Xilong stood upon the hill, his glaive in hand as he overlooked the battlefield. A cavalry of Chinese Wulin warriors all around him, horses snorting and pawing. Beside him stood a young Zanhu, obviously the one who had called down the fire to save me. He overlooked the fight, and the orcs had now turned their attention to the new and very interesting prey. Tian Xilong did not even appear troubled, more annoyed. "Honor in victory and in death! Go, my blue dragons!" he bellowed. A roar that would have shaken hell answered him as the cavalry charged. Wulin warriors charged headlong into the orc line and tore it apart. As fire swallows wood, I watched as the Wulin forces slowly began to eat their way through the orcs. A lovely Nusha dodged in and out of the carnage, dragging down her prey and bisecting their heads and arms from their bodies. Tiandi warriors joined the fray, with screams louder than even the orcs. They cleaved through flesh and bone with their Dao swords, and even as Shaolin, to my surprise, made swift work of 2 orcs at once with only his staff and martial fury. My heart returned to me in that moment, and I turned to my forces. "To me!" I shouted. "Reinforce the blue dragons!" It took only the command. The remaining Sisters of Lupin turned and advanced, laying into the orcs, and for the first time, the orcs were now losing ground. Some were even panicking, slaughtering each other in their mad attempts to get away. Unlikely. Orcs do not comprehend battlefield fear like we do. If anything, the arrival of new enemies to a fight would only get them more excited. Only when their lines completely break do orcs even show something resembling fear. It's far more likely that the orcs got so caught up in the carnage that they stopped caring about who or what they killed as long as they were killing something. The battle was swift and merciless. On more than one occasion, I was standing back to back with a Wulin I'd never met, forced to fend off a greenskin's desperate attack. And though we were not without our own losses, the orcs suffered greater. In an hour, the battle had turned. The orcs that were not dead were finally retreating back over the ridge. I found myself on my knees, exhausted, and the weight of battle on my shoulders. I was only roused from my exhaustion when I heard 2 feet approach me. I glanced up to see Tian Xilong looking down at me with curiosity. "You are not one of the Noble Legion," he said impassively. "No, I am Helena, leader of the Sisters of Lupin," I answered him. He raised an eyebrow. "The defectors from Horkos. Odd to see you fighting here." "I owed a favor to the Night Warden," I answered coolly, looking over the many dead sisters at this point. The Sisters of Lupin would be all but extinguished. We barely numbered 30 now. I managed to catch sight of William's sister among the living, so at least she survived. That would please the Night Warden. Tian Xilong turned his attention to the heated battle below us. Though we'd stopped these reinforcements, our allies were still struggling to hold off the main force of the Green Sea. "We should go to their aid, and quickly," I hissed. "No," Xilong retorted. "Your soldiers need to recover. The blue dragons will engage the enemy." He turned to Tian Di and spoke in that strange language I would never be able to comprehend. The Tian Di gave a nod and a shout. The Wulin that had survived mounted their horses again. and I watched as nearly 600 warriors began to ride down into the war beyond them. My heart wanted to follow, but Tian Qilong put a hand on my shoulder first. "You and I must speak. I had wanted to talk to the Night Warden first, but I'm afraid this news cannot wait." "What is it?" I asked. "We were delayed in coming due to an incident to the eastern coast of Valkenheim," he explained. "We found something there. Something terrible." "I'm not surprised," I answered. "Horkos has a commanding presence of Valkenheim's coast thanks to their pirate allies." I shrugged. "I'm sure you stumbled across some of their destruction." Qilong shook his head. "What we found, it was not Horkos." And to my never-ending surprise and fear, I heard terror seep into the Zhangjun's voice. "We found something far worse." An apt description, to say the least. But Tian Qilong had no idea just how serious his discovery was. This orc infestation was a threat, make no mistake, but there are worse things than orcs in this wretched galaxy, and by the Emperor... Well, perhaps I shouldn't get too ahead of myself. One world-ending threat at a time, I suppose.